joint presentation, and we're going to talk about some of the material that Byra just brought up, and Caroline is going to give the details of the scientific analysis and talk more about this specific material. There's still so much work to be done. I mean, the sites are actively being recovered, and there's a lot more textile, and there are conservation concerns and all sorts of things that the work that is going to take years, honestly, to continue and eventually complete this analysis of the textiles. So what I'm going to do is just try to get you excited about textile archaeology and what the potential really is, what kinds of things we can learn, and what kinds of ideas are interesting to think about in the context of the Mongol period specifically through the lens of textile archaeology. So this is how we're going to do, how we're going to organize it. So we'll do sort of the basic concepts and questions first, and then move on to Caroline's presentation of their recent analysis at the Smithsonian. Okay, so basics of textile archaeology, what you need to know. The kind of initial research is very technical and looking at how these objects are produced and from what materials and using what tools. So we're looking at the structure of the weave. There are two main structures that we see in these materials that can be built upon. So these basic weaves are tabby, which is your over under one, and then twill, which you go over 2 or 3 and under 1. And those weaves, which exist really early, we have evidence of these weaves in the Bronze Age in Xinjiang, for example, in wool. Those weaves get built upon and developed into really sophisticated polychrome and compound weave structures, but it all kind of starts with these basic kind of structures. We're also looking at thread technologies. So we're going to see some threads that are spun. So that's using a spindle. Eventually we get the spinning wheel that creates threads that have a twist, which can be in an S direction or a Z direction. Then there are also threads important in this context that have no twist. In the literature you might see STA, that's French, it's sans tension apriciable. So that's the threads that don't have a twist, and that's particular to silk production and to certain processes of silk production. And then I just have a couple pictures of looms so you get an idea of, you can make textiles in a nomadic context. And we've done some recent work looking at textiles in the 10th century that are wool, that seem to be local, produced in a nomadic context. Very, very simple looms. Because they're so simple, really just a set of sticks, we're not recovering them, we haven't recovered them, we may not recover them archaeologically, but we can look at the textiles themselves when they do preserve. We're lucky in Mongolia to have frozen and dry contexts in which we do have some of this evidence. And then looms can get incredibly complex. This is an illustration of a Chinese draw loom. And notice that there's actually a boy up here who is manipulating these heddles to make a very complex pattern. And this is more the kind of loom where we're seeing these textiles from Horeg that are really incredibly complex. Okay, so this is just a list. This is an incomplete list of the types of data that we can collect from archaeological textiles. Something that's really interesting about textiles in comparison to other types of material culture is that you can see every part of the process in the finished product. Other types of craft production, even though there are ways to get in and use microscopy, for example, to look at elements of the production sequence that might not be immediately obvious, textiles, it's all there on the surface. And we can do other kinds of scientific analysis, for example, what Caroline will talk about, to look at, for example, dye analysis or proteins. But in terms of the techniques that go into the process, we can kind of see all of it added together, which means that textiles are a particularly rich source of evidence on craft technology. So just an example, this is the 10th century wool textile material from the site of Uzurgalan. And this is a bag, part of a bag. Doesn't look like much, looks kind of messy, but this is the data that you can collect from just this detail of one bag. And then you start to get an assemblage and you start to compare assemblages, and this becomes a really rich source of information about cultural practices. So silk, most of the material from both Horeg and Namtul, is silk. There's also a lot of felt, as well as leather, and Caroline will show some of the leather, and also wild animal furs that are used as trim, for example, but most of the textile material is silk. So some basic things you need to know about silk. It's proteinaceous, so that's in contrast to cellulosic plant fibers, and it's produced from a moth. I'd encourage everyone to look up videos of what silk moths really look like, because I don't think we necessarily appreciate the bugginess of silk production, but it's really interesting. It's really different from other textiles for that reason. Most silk in this period is produced from domesticated silk moths, Bombyx mori. But there are other types of silk, and there are other traditions of collecting the broken cocoons of many different species of silk moths. So Bo, I don't know if he's here, oh yes, is doing really, really interesting work looking at the protein signatures of different species of silk moths to actually identify these really important sources of wild silk in the past in different contexts. So we'll get into this a little bit more in detail, but in the Mongol period, what's really, really interesting and what has been explored fairly extensively is the fact that we get these kind of Eastern traditions and Western traditions coming together and merging, and we have people trained in different traditions working together and sharing techniques. One of the ways that we see that is in the treatment of the threads. So we see people using different thread treatments or kind of combining weaving styles and technologies with different technologies associated with thread production. And one of those is that the Chinese tradition of silk production generally produces threads without spin because they're reeling out complete unbroken threads, and that in traditions that develop in Central Asia, using also domesticated silk moths, they tend to spin the thread. So we see in this assemblage, we see both. So there are long textile traditions in Inner Asia, and we're really fortunate to have some really early evidence from dry context, from frozen context. So we don't really have Bronze Age textile material. We've just heard how Bronze Age burials tend to be shallow and not preserve a lot of material of any kind. But just to the south in Xinjiang, there is an enormous amount of really important Bronze Age textile material, and that includes felt and woven fabrics that then are in turn related to textile material that's been found in the Altai, especially in the Russian Altai, but people have begun to excavate Pazyryk burials in Mongolia as well. So in the Altai, these are frozen contexts, so really, really excellent preservation that show the beginning of these imported materials. So there's some silk, there's embroidered silk found in Pazyryk burials, but there's also woolen fabric, there's cotton fabric, which is also an import, but not from China at this time. It would have been from the West or from India. In the Xiongnu period, of course, we have the famous no-yunol material, the no-yunol carpet, and we're going to see how some of these techniques involved in producing the no-yunol carpet continue actually to the present day. But we see them in this material in the Mongol period as well. So these are appliqued and quilted felts. This is the same technique that's used to make both Mongol felt carpets and ger doors, as well as decorated polychrome Kazakh carpets. It's really the same technique. You'll notice that the border of the felt design has a thread around it. This is spun thread, and it's actually two spun threads in two different directions typically. Sometimes it's just one. And it's couched on, so that means the thread is applied to the surface and then stitched on. We're going to see that in some of the silk material, which is pretty interesting. And then again, in the 3rd century CE, we see the first evidence for local silk production in Xinjiang, and that's the beginning of this kind of Western tradition of silk production. But ultimately, there are silk industries in the Middle Ages and later in Europe as well, so it really expands. So silk is really, really interesting in the Mongol Empire, and there has been work, especially looking at historical texts, looking at silk and the roles it played in the Mongol Empire. So it's exciting to have this opportunity to bring the archaeology into conversation with the history. So one thing that gets talked about is these state-sponsored workshops where there seems to have been a really intentional bringing together of craftspeople with different kinds of training, which creates this incredible diversity of textiles. Textile exchange, all kinds of exchange, really boom across all of Eurasia. So you see references to Tartary cloth in medieval European sources where the cloth from the Mongol Empire is famous around the world, and the Mongol elites become sponsors of these craft traditions. There are all sorts of really interesting records of people visiting the Mongol court and describing that they see gold and silk everywhere. And they're describing it inside of the gear, they're describing it decorating the horses and the camels, everyone's wearing it, the Khan is giving it to everyone. So it's really abundant. And it is important in terms of political exchange and gift giving, and expressing the wealth and the generosity of the Khan. What I'm really interested is local practices. So we're interested in. There have been a lot of really interesting studies. I recommend, if people are interested, Tom Alson's book, Commodity Exchange in the Mongol Empire, is a really excellent study from a historical perspective of what silk does in Mongol political culture. But I think once we look at the archaeology, we're also going to see local practices that go beyond a little bit some of this political activity. It's really important, but I think there's more that we can get out of this material. And one of that is that we're seeing silk really incorporated into local kinds of aesthetics and local craft traditions, where Mongolian craftsmen are also adopting some of these raw materials and incorporating them into making dells, for example, or in these gear, these really unique nomadic contexts that are using imported and foreign silk, but they're doing it in a very Mongolian way and in a way that is meaningful in this context. Ultimately, of course, silk gets imported into local ritual. So anytime you're using a haddock, that's silk that has become really important in Mongolian ritual. And there is evidence that textiles are used in certain ways, felt is used in certain ways, in ritual ways, and people have ideas about the meaning of these materials. So this is an example of what I'm talking about with the Mongolian techniques adopting imported material. So the dell that Bayer excavated from Bukhanusho in Henti, it's all silk. None of this is material that is traditionally produced in Mongolia or with Mongolian methods. However, the dell is, of course, a Mongolian garment. And this is all applique. And it's actually cut up little pieces of golden silk. It's not one piece, it's little scraps that have all been cut up and fit together in the shape. And then it's twisted silk, spun silk, that's then used as the border around the applique, couching, exactly the same technique people have been using since the Iron Age in felt that they're applying to silk. And we have this also from Horik. So this is an example, a micrograph of one of the textiles from Horik, where we see this is spun silk, and they've spun it, and they put two opposite spun threads next to each other and couched them together. They're using silk as if it were wool. They're using silk in exactly the same kind of techniques, creating the same kind of aesthetic. I think something that will be interesting to explore is to look at silk and the role of women. Textile archaeology sometimes gets kind of reduced to something that's just about women, but it's about everyone. And too often the perspective of women and the experiences and contributions of women have been kind of overlooked in favor of looking at kind of the martial history, political history, even though we know, of course, that the Mongol queens were so incredibly important in the governance of the Mongol Empire. But there are these sort of hints when we look at the text where we see that women seem to be really, really involved in, if not weaving, which this golden textile is produced in these really specialized workshops. It seems that the textiles usually were brought to court, and actually garments and objects were produced by Mongol women we have these records that show that the Mongol queens had sewing girls as part of their retinue and part of their responsibility. And we can see this is a part of the legal code that we see that, so that this, I kind of skipped over this, the Jisun feast is a feast of robes of one color. So everyone in different, sometimes the texts describe it as the Khan gave clothes of one color to everyone, and maybe for a week, or for, I think as an example, 40 days, everyone in attendance at the feast had to wear a garment of one color. So this shows just how much wealth. People didn't used to change their clothes every day, right? People had fewer garments typically, but if you have, everyone has to change their clothes to a new color every single day, that's really an expression of wealth. But I think this is very interesting because it's not the person presumably wearing the garment who gets punished for wearing the wrong garment. We can imagine these feasts, and they've been imagined as kind of this uniform and this expression of unity. We can look at it in kind of masculine terms of a uniform, of everyone dressing the same because they're part of this collective. But it's not the person who's meant to be dressing the same who gets punished if there's a mistake. It's the woman who's in charge of making the garment. So I think there's an interesting way in which women's participation in making clothes, in taking these textiles produced from around the empire and forming them into Mongol garments and things that the whole community is wearing, that's also regulated, that's a site of political control and engagement on the part of women. So now I'll turn it over to Caroline to talk more specifically about the scientific analysis.
Okay. So I'm not going to talk too much about the sites where where the textiles were found. At the Smithsonian, we received about 40 samples of textiles, about 20 from Korik and 20 from the North Mountain. So we were a mixture of silk, fur, leather, and here are some of the examples of the textiles that were sent to us. Like we got very tiny samples of them. And yeah, so textile with the cold threads were really interesting for us, and I will talk about them a bit more later. So what I'm going to show you is a preliminary proteomics analysis results on these textiles. Proteomics, it's basically a technique that uses mass spectrometry to characterize proteins. So it's used in cultural heritage to characterize the type of tissues if it's made of proteins, the species it's made from, and also look at degradation of proteins to get an idea of molecular damage of the object that's a molecular damage, molecular level. So proteomics is a very well-suited technique for textiles because textiles and clothing are made of very often of animal fibers. So we have three types of categories of proteins we're going to be looking at. In fur and wool, hair, we're going to be looking at keratins. We have two types of keratin, the acetic type, the basic type, and they form this sort of microfibrils. It's not just one protein, it's multiple proteins, but they have like similar sequences and structure. In skin, we're going to be looking at collagens. There are many different types of collagen, but in skin you're going to find type 1 collagen in majority, and then some level of type 3 collagen. And the last one, but I won't present data on this, it's silk fibroins. For that, if you want, you're going to have to ask Bo, because she's an expert. So I'm going to really talk about only the collagen and keratins today. So the way proteomics work, so here it's a sequence of keratin. It's about 400 amino acids. Each letter represents an amino acid. And on the top, the first line is a sequence from sheep. On the second line is a sequence from Mustela pustorius, which is a ferret. And because these two species are quite far away, on the genetic level, they're quite different. So we can see a lot of differences on the proteins the protein sequences. So all these differences, I've highlighted them in yellow. And so when we do the mass spectrometry analysis, what we do is we take a small sample, we solubilize it, we digest this sample with an enzyme, which is going to cut the protein sequence into small fragments. These small fragments are called peptides, and then we analyze them by mass spectrometry, and we can reconstruct the sequence, or match the mass spectrum to a specific sequence. So on the top, you have the sequence from the sheep, and on the bottom, a sequence from the ferret, and you can see it's only one amino acid is different. Y is F in the ferret, so it's a different mass and it's a different mass spectrum. So looking at this type of markers, we can identify what species this protein is made from. So an example is this wool fragment from NOMD, and here are all the different proteins of keratins that are identified and the species that are best matched for each protein. And here we have the best match is Ovis aries, so sheep. And we can verify that by having this specific peptide from sheep. We know it's sheep because if it was goat, it would be a different sequence. And so we can do that with all type of fur and hair. And here I have two samples of fur from NOMD again. And here we have a different type of different identification. The sample is matched to two species, which are Mustelidae species. And we have one marker that tells us it's definitely a Mustelidae species. But we don't have formal identification. We have two species because, and again, the second sample, we get the same type of result. So what happened is that the database of protein sequences are limited, and we only have two species of Mustelidae, mustelids in the database, which are the sea otter, Enhydra lutris, and the ferret, so Mustela pistorius. But we know in Mongolia there can be many other types of furs that were used. So could be ermine, could be sable, could be beech marten or wolverine. And all these are different species that are not in database yet. So the next step on this project is going to be to create a database of all the species that are native to Mongolia and get a better database for identification. So I'll go quickly on the leather, which we had 9 samples. So now we are identifying collagen. The majority of the samples were matched to cow or yak, which can't be distinguished by proteomics. 3 samples were from horse and 1 was from goat. And it would be interesting to see with more samples whether there is some correlation between what species we found and what kind of element of clothing they were used for. But now let's talk about metal threads, which is really a big project for me because I've been studying this type of metal thread from all over Europe to Asia, and in particular the type that is organic metal thread. So by that I mean metal threads that are made with organic protein substrate or protein adhesive. So these threads were made on one type, they were made on an organic strip, which can be paper. So paper is not protein, so I'm not going to talk much about this one. In Europe, they were made by coating intestinal membrane with gold or silver. And the most common one is the one made with leather, so leather or skin tissues. There are other types of way to gild textiles, which is one type by applying the gold directly on the threads, on the yarn, which is quite a rare example, but I'll talk a bit more after that. And another type is just by directly painting or printing a textile with gold. And so, yes, these textiles are very important for Mongolia, and what we are trying to do with this research is reconstruct the threads, see what materials were used, what species were used, to try to correlate some textiles which have uncertain provenance with a certain workshop or certain technique of fabrication. Also, these textiles were often ended up in Europe, when they were reused to make ecclesiastical textiles, like this one. That's one I analyzed, and the basic structure of these threads are made with sheep skin, on which the gold is applied with a fish glue adhesive, which is very often sturgeon. So now if we turn to the textiles samples from Gorig, here we have two types, flat strip and wrapped thread, and again we identify the same structure, which is a sheepskin with a sturgeon adhesive. Unfortunately, there are, again, very few species of sturgeon in database, so the identification of the sturgeon here is much lower than what I found in the previous sample, and that could be because it's just different type of fish, of sturgeon. And then if we go to the ones which were coated with gold, we also find some sheep. It's probably a glue made of sheep and fish glue. But the difference between the two samples is that the first one had a fish from the Northwest Pacific, which is a yellow croaker, when the second one has a sturgeon fish glue. So hopefully by analyzing more of these samples, we can start reconstructing patterns of how they were made, and do more analysis on these threads and textiles.